Ursula decreed that the wake would be in her house. Father Nicanor was against a religious ceremony and burial in consecrated ground. Ursula stood up to him. "In a way that neither you nor I can understand, that man was a saint," she said. "So I'm going to bury him, against your wishes, beside Melchiadesh's grave." She did it with the support of the whole town and with a magnificent funeral. Amaranta did not leave her bedroom. From her bed she heard Ursula's weeping, the steps and whispers of the multitude that invaded the house, the wailing of the mourners, and then a deep silence that smelled of trampled flowers. For a long time she kept on smelling Pietro Crespi's lavender breath at dusk, but she had the strength not to succumb to delirium. Ursula abandoned her. She did not even raise her eyes to pity her on the afternoon when Amaranta went into the kitchen and put her hand into the coals of the stove until it hurt her so much that she felt no more pain, but instead smelled the pestilence of her own singed flesh. It was a stupid cure for her remorse. For several days she went about the house with her hand in a pot of egg whites, and when the burns healed, it appeared as if the whites had also scarred over the sores on her heart. The only external trace that the tragedy left was the bandage of black gauze that she put on her burned hand and that she wore until her death. Arcadio gave a rare display of generosity by decreeing official mourning for Pietro Crespi. Ursula interpreted it as the return of the strayed lamb. But she was mistaken. She had lost Arcadio, not when he had put on his military uniform, but from the beginning. She thought she had raised him as a son, as she had raised Rebecca, with no privileges or discrimination. Nevertheless, Arcadio was a solitary and frightened child during the insomnia plague, in the midst of Ursula's utilitarian fervour, during the delirium of José Arcadio Buendia, the hermetism of Aureliano, and the mortal rivalry between Amaranta and Rebecca. Aureliano had taught him to read and write, thinking about other things, as he would have done with a stranger. He gave him his clothing so that Visitazione could take it in when it was ready to be thrown away. Arcadio suffered from shoes that were too large, from his patched pants, from his female buttocks. He never succeeded in communicating with anyone better than he did with Visitazione and Cataure in their language. Melchiades was the only one who really was concerned with him, as he made him listen to his incomprehensible texts and gave him lessons in the art of daguerreotype. No one imagined how much he wept in secret, and the desperation with which he tried to revive Melchiades with the useless study of his papers. The school, where they paid attention to him and respected him, and then power, with his endless decrees and his glorious uniform, freed him from the weight of an old bitterness. One night, in Caterino's store, someone dared tell him, "You don't deserve the last name you carry." Contrary to what everyone expected, Arcadio did not have him shot. "To my great honour," he said, "I am not a Buendia." Those who knew the secret of his parentage thought that the answer meant that he too was aware of it, but he had really never been. Pilar Ternera, his mother, who had made his blood boil in the darkroom, was as much an irresistible obsession for him as she had been first for José Arcadio and then for Aureliano. In spite of her having lost her charms and the splendour of her laugh, he sought her out and found her by the trail of her smell of smoke. A short time before the war, one noon, when she was later than usual in coming for her younger son at school, Arcadio was waiting for her in the room where he was accustomed to take his siesta, and where he later set up the stocks. While the child played in the courtyard, he waited in his hammock, trembling with anxiety, knowing that Pilar Ternera would have to pass through there. She arrived. Arcadio grabbed her by the wrist and tried to pull her into the hammock. I can't, Pilar Ternera said in horror. You can't imagine how much I would like to make you happy, but as God is my witness, I can't. Arcadio took her by the waist with his tremendous hereditary strength, and he felt the world disappear with the contact of her skin. Don't play the saint, he said. After all, everybody knows that you're a whore. Pilar overcame the disgust that her miserable fate inspired in her. The children will find out, she murmured. It will be better if you leave the bar off the door tonight. Arcadio waited for her that night, trembling with fever in his hammock. He waited without sleeping, listening to the aroused crickets in the endless hours of early morning and the implacable telling of time by the curlews, more and more convinced that he had been deceived. Suddenly, when anxiety had broken down into rage, the door opened. A few months later, facing the firing squad, Arcadio would relive the wandering steps in the classroom, the stumbling against benches, and finally the bulk of a body in the shadows of the room and the breathing of air that was pumped by a heart that was not his. He stretched out his hand and found another hand with 2 rings on the same finger about to go astray in the darkness. He felt the structure of the veins, the pulse of its misfortune, and felt the damp palm with a lifeline cut off at the base of the thumb by the claws of death. Then he realized that this was not the woman he was waiting for, because she did not smell of smoke but of flower lotion, and she had inflated, blind breasts with nipples like a man's, a sex as stony and round as a nut, and the chaotic tenderness of excited inexperience. She was a virgin, and she had the unlikely name of Santa Sofia de la Piedad. Pilar Ternera had paid her 50 pesos, half of her life savings, to do what she was doing. Arcadio had seen her many times working in her parents' small food store, but he had never taken a good look at her, because she had that rare virtue of never existing completely except at the opportune moment. But from that day on, he huddled like a cat in the warmth of her armpit. She would go to the school at siesta time with the consent of her parents, to whom Pilar Ternera had paid the other half of her savings. Later on, when the government troops dislodged them from the place where they had made love, they did it among the cans of lard and sacks of corn in the back of the store. About the time that Arcadio was named civil and military leader, they had a daughter. The only relatives who knew about it were José Arcadio and Rebecca, with whom Arcadio maintained close relations at that time, based not so much on kinship as on complicity. José Arcadio had put his neck into the marital yoke. Rebecca's firm character, the veracity of her stomach, her tenacious ambition absorbed the tremendous energy of her husband, who had been changed from a lazy, woman-chasing man into an enormous work animal. They kept a clean and neat house. Rebecca would open it wide at dawn, and the wind from the graveyard would come in through the windows and go out through the doors to the yard, and leave the whitewashed walls and furniture tanned by the saltpetre of the dead. Her hunger for earth, the clock-clock of her parents' bones, the impatience of her blood as it faced Pietro Crespi's passivity, were relegated to the attic of her memory. All day long she would embroider beside the window, withdrawn from the uneasiness of the war, until the ceramic pots would begin to vibrate in the cupboard, and she would get up to warm the meal, much before the appearance, first of the mangy hounds, and then of the colossus in leggings and spurs with a double-barrelled shotgun, who sometimes carried a deer on his shoulder, and almost always a string of rabbits or wild ducks. One afternoon, at the beginning of his rule, Arcadio paid them a surprise visit. They had not seen him since they had left the house, but he seemed so friendly and familiar that they invited him to share the stew. Only when they were having coffee did Arcadio reveal the motive behind his visit. He had received a complaint against José Arcadio. It was said that he had begun by ploughing his own yard and had gone straight ahead into neighbouring lands, knocking down fences and buildings with his oxen, until he took forcible possession of the best plots of land around. On the peasants, whom he had not despoiled because he was not interested in their lands, he levied a contribution, which he collected every Saturday with his hunting dogs and his double-barrelled shotgun. He did not deny it. He based his right on the fact that the usurped lands had been distributed by José Arcadio Buendía at the time of the founding, and he thought it possible to prove that his father had been crazy ever since that time, for he had disposed of a patrimony that really belonged to the family. It was an unnecessary allegation, because Arcadio had not come to do justice. He simply offered to set up a registry office so that José Arcadio could legalize his title to the usurped land, under the condition that he delegate to the local government the right to collect the contributions. They made an agreement. Years later, when Colonel Aureliano Buendía examined the titles to property, he found registered in his brother's name all of the land between the hill where his yard was on up to the horizon, including the cemetery, and discovered that during the 11 months of his rule, Arcadio had collected not only the money of the contributions, but had also collected fees from people for the right to bury their dead in José Arcadio's land. It took Ursula several months to find out what was already public knowledge, because people hid it from her so as not to increase her suffering. At first, she suspected it. "Arcadio is building a house," she confided with feigned pride to her husband as she tried to put a spoonful of calabash syrup into his mouth. Nevertheless, she involuntarily sighed and said, "I don't know why, but all this has a bad smell to me." Later on, when she found out that Arcadio had not only built a house, but had ordered some Viennese furniture, she confirmed her suspicion that he was using public funds. "You're the shame of our family name," she shouted at him one Sunday after Mass, when she saw him in his new house playing cards with his officers. Arcadio paid no attention to her. Only then did Ursula know that he had a 6-month-old daughter, and that Santa Sofia de la Piedad, with whom he was living outside of marriage, was pregnant again. She decided to write to Colonel Aureliano Buendía, wherever he was, to bring him up to date on the situation. But the fast-moving events of those days not only prevented her plans from being carried out, they made her regret having conceived them. The war, which until then had been only a word to designate a vague and remote circumstance, became a concrete and dramatic reality. Around the end of February, an old woman with an ashen look arrived in Macondo riding a donkey loaded down with brooms. She seemed so inoffensive that the sentries let her pass without any questions, as another vendor, one of the many who often arrived from the towns in the swamp. She went directly to the barracks. Arcadio received her in the place where the classroom used to be, and which at that time had been transformed into a kind of rear-guard encampment, with rolled hammocks hanging on hooks, and mats piled up in the corners, and rifles and carbines and even hunting shotguns scattered on the floor. The old woman stiffened into a military salute before identifying herself. "I am Colonel Gregorio Stevenson." He brought bad news. The last centres of liberal resistance, according to what he said, were being wiped out. Colonel Aureliano Buendía, whom he had left fighting in retreat near Riohacha, had given him a message for Arcadio. He should surrender the town without resistance on the condition that the lives and property of liberals would be respected. Arcadio examined that strange messenger, who could have been a fugitive grandmother, with a look of pity. "You have brought something in writing, naturally," he said. "Naturally," the emissary answered. "I have brought nothing of the sort. It's easy to understand that under the present circumstances, a person can't carry anything that would compromise him." As he was speaking, he reached into his bodice and took out a small gold fish. "I think that this will be sufficient," he said. Arcadio could see that indeed it was one of the little fishes made by Colonel Aureliano Buendia. But anyone could have brought it before the war or stolen it, and it had no merit as a safe conduct pass. The messenger even went to the extreme of violating a military secret so that they would believe his identity. He revealed that he was on a mission to Curaçao, where he hoped to recruit exiles from all over the Caribbean and acquire arms and supplies sufficient to attempt a landing at the end of the year. With faith in that plan, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was not in favour of any useless sacrifices at that time. But Arcadio was inflexible. He had the prisoner put into the stocks until he could prove his identity, and he resolved to defend the town to the death. He did not have long to wait. The news of the Liberal defeat was more and more concrete. Towards the end of March, before a dawn of premature rain, the tense calm of the previous weeks was abruptly broken by the desperate sounds of a cornet and a cannon shot that knocked down the steeple of the church. Actually, Arcadio's decision to resist was madness. He had only 50 poorly armed men, with a ration of 20 cartridges apiece. But among them, his former pupils, excited by the high-sounding proclamations, the determination reigned to sacrifice their skins for a lost cause. In the midst of the tramping of boots, contradictory commands, cannon shots that made the earth tremble, wild shooting, and the senseless sound of cornets, the supposed Colonel Stevenson managed to speak to Arcadio. "Don't let me undergo the indignity of dying in the stocks in these women's clothes," he said to him. "If I have to die, let me die fighting." He succeeded in convincing him. Arcadio ordered them to give him a weapon and 20 cartridges, and he left him with 5 men to defend headquarters while he went off with his staff to head up the resistance. He did not get to the road to the swamp. The barricades had been broken, and the defenders were openly fighting in the streets, first until they used up their ration of rifle bullets, then with pistols against rifles, and finally hand to hand. With the imminence of defeat, some women went into the street armed with sticks and kitchen knives. In that confusion, Arcadio found Amaranta, who was looking for him like a madwoman, in her nightgown and with 2 old pistols that had belonged to José Arcadio Buendia. He gave his rifle to an officer who had been disarmed in the fight, and escaped with Amaranta through a nearby street to take her home. Ursula was in the doorway waiting, indifferent to the cannon shots that had opened up a hole in the front of the house next door. The rain was letting up, but the streets were as slippery and as smooth as melted soap, and one had to guess distances in the darkness. Arcadio left Amaranta with Ursula and made an attempt to face 2 soldiers who had opened up with heavy firing from the corner. The old pistols that had been kept for many years in the bureau didn't work. Protecting Arcadio with her body, Ursula tried to drag him towards the house. "Come along in the name of God!" she shouted at him. "There's been enough madness." The soldiers aimed at them. "Let go of that man, ma'am," one of them shouted, "or we won't be responsible." Arcadio pushed Ursula towards the house and surrendered. A short time later the shooting stopped, and the bells began to toll. The resistance had been wiped out in less than half an hour. Not a single one of Arcadio's men had survived the attack, but before dying they had killed 300 soldiers. The last stronghold was the barracks. Before being attacked, the supposed Colonel Gregorio Stevenson had freed the prisoners and ordered his men to go out and fight in the street. The extraordinary mobility and accurate aim with which he placed his 20 cartridges gave the impression that the barracks was well defended, and the attackers blew it to pieces with cannon fire. The captain who directed the operation was startled to find the rubble deserted and a single dead man in his undershorts with an empty rifle still clutched in an arm that had been blown completely off. He had a woman's full head of hair held at the neck with a comb, and on his neck a chain with a small gold fish. When he turned him over with the tip of his boot and put the light on his face, the captain was perplexed. "Jesus Christ!" he exclaimed. Other officers came over. "Look where this fellow turned up," the captain said. "It's Gregorio Stevenson." At dawn, after a summary court-martial, Arcadio was shot against the wall of the cemetery. In the last 2 hours of his life, he did not manage to understand why the fear that had tormented him since childhood had disappeared. Impassive, without even worrying about making a show of his recent bravery, he listened to the interminable charges of the accusation. He thought about Ursula, who at that hour must have been under the chestnut tree having coffee with José Arcadio Buendía. He thought about his 8-month-old daughter, who still had no name, and about the child who was going to be born in August. He thought about Santa Sofia de la Piedad, whom he had left the night before salting down a deer for next day's lunch, and he missed her hair pouring over her shoulders and her eyelashes, which looked as if they were artificial. He thought about his people without sentimentality, with a strict closing of his accounts with life, beginning to understand how much he really loved the people he hated most. The president of the court-martial began his final speech, when Arcadio realized that 2 hours had passed. "Even if the proven charges did not have merit enough," the president was saying, "the irresponsible and criminal boldness with which the accused drove his subordinates on to a useless death would be enough to deserve capital punishment." In the shattered schoolhouse, where for the first time he had felt the security of power, a few feet from the room where he had come to know the uncertainty of love, Arcadio found the formality of death ridiculous. Death really did not matter to him, but life did, and therefore the sensation he felt when they gave their decision was not a feeling of fear, but of nostalgia. He did not speak until they asked him for his last request. "Tell my wife," he answered in a well-modulated voice, "to give the girl the name of Ursula." He paused and said it again. "Ursula, like her grandmother. And tell her also that if the child that is to be born is a boy, they should name him José Arcadio, not for his uncle, but for his grandfather." Before they took him to the execution wall, Father Nicanor tried to attend him. "I have nothing to repent," Arcadio said, and he put himself under the orders of the squad after drinking a cup of black coffee. The leader of the squad, a specialist in summary executions, had a name that had much more about it than chance. Captain Roc Carnicero, which meant butcher. On the way to the cemetery, under the persistent drizzle, Arcadio saw that a radiant Wednesday was breaking out on the horizon. His nostalgia disappeared with the mist and left an immense curiosity in its place. Only when they ordered him to put his back to the wall did Arcadio see Rebecca, with wet hair and a pink-flowered dress, opening wide the door. He made an effort to get her to recognize him, and Rebecca did take a casual look towards the wall, and was paralyzed with stupor, barely able to react and wave goodbye to Arcadio. Arcadio answered her the same way. At that instant, the smoking mouths of the rifles were aimed at him, and letter by letter he heard the encyclicals that Melquiades had chanted, and he heard the lost steps of Santa Sofia de la Piedad, a virgin, in the classroom. And in his nose he felt the same icy hardness that had drawn his attentions in the nostrils of the corpse of Remedios. "Oh, God damn it," he managed to think. "I forgot to say that if it was a girl they should name her Remedios." Then, all accumulated in the rip of a claw, he felt again all the terror that had tormented him in his life. The captain gave the order to fire. Arcadio barely had time to put out his chest and raise his head, not understanding where the hot liquid that burned his thighs was pouring from. "Bastards!" he shouted. "Long live the Liberal Party!" The war was over in May. 2 weeks before the government made the official announcement in a high-sounding proclamation, which promised merciless punishment for those who had started the rebellion, Colonel Aureliano Buendia fell prisoner just as he was about to reach the western frontier, disguised as an Indian witch-doctor. Of the 21 men who had followed him to war, 14 fell in combat, 6 were wounded, and only 1 accompanied him at the moment of final defeat. Colonel Gerineldo Marquez. The news of his capture was announced in Macondo with a special proclamation. "He's alive," Ursula told her husband. "Let's pray to God for his enemies to show him clemency." After 3 days of weeping, one afternoon as she was stirring some sweet milk candy in the kitchen, she heard her son's voice clearly in her ear. "It was Aureliano!" she shouted, running towards the chestnut tree to tell her husband the news. "I don't know how the miracle took place, but he's alive, and we're going to see him very soon." She took it for granted. She had the floors of the house scrubbed and changed the position of the furniture. 1 week later, a rumour from somewhere that was not supported by any proclamation gave dramatic confirmation to the prediction. Colonel Aureliano Buendia had been condemned to death, and the sentence would be carried out in Macondo as a lesson to the population. One Monday at 10:30 in the morning, Amaranta was dressing Aureliano José when she heard the sound of a distant troop and the blast of a cornet 1 second before Ursula burst into the room with the shout, "They're bringing him now!" The troop struggled to subdue the overflowing crowd with their rifle butts. Ursula and Amaranta ran to the corner, pushing their way through, and then they saw him. He looked like a beggar. His clothing was torn, his hair and beard were tangled, and he was barefoot. He was walking without feeling the burning dust, his hands tied behind his back with a rope that a mounted officer had attached to the head of his horse. Along with him, also ragged and defeated, they were bringing Colonel Gerineldo Marquez. They were not sad. They seemed more disturbed by the crowd that was shouting all kinds of insults at the troops. "My son!" Ursula shouted in the midst of the uproar, and she slapped the soldier who tried to hold her back. The officer's horse reared. Then Colonel Aureliano Buendia stopped, tremulous, avoided the arms of his mother, and fixed a stern look on her eyes. "Go home, Mama," he said. "Get permission from the authorities to come see me in jail." He looked at Amaranta, who stood indecisively 2 steps behind Ursula, and he smiled as he asked her, "What happened to your hand?" Amaranta raised the hand with the black bandage. "A burn," she said, and took Ursula away so that the horses would not run her down. The troop took off. A special guard surrounded the prisoners and took them to the jail at a trot. At dusk, Ursula visited Colonel Aureliano Buendia in jail. She had tried to get permission through Don Apolinar Moscote, but he had lost all authority in the face of the military omnipotence. Father Nicanor was in bed with hepatic fever. The parents of Colonel Gerineldo Marquez, who had not been condemned to death, had tried to see him and were driven off with rifle butts. Facing the impossibility of finding anyone to intervene, convinced that her son would be shot at dawn, Ursula wrapped up the things she wanted to bring him and went to the jail alone. "I am the mother of Colonel Aureliano Buendia," she announced. The sentries blocked her way. "I'm going in any case," Ursula warned them. "So if you have orders to shoot, start right in." She pushed one of them aside and went into the former classroom, where a group of half-dressed soldiers were oiling their weapons. An officer in a field uniform, ruddy-faced, with very thick glasses and ceremonious manners, signalled to the sentries to withdraw. "I am the mother of Colonel Aureliano Buendia," Ursula repeated. "You must mean," the officer corrected her with a friendly smile, "that you are the mother of Mr. Aureliano Buendia." Ursula recognized in his affected way of speaking the languid cadence of the stuck-up people from the Highlands. "As you say, Mr., she accepted, "just as long as I can see him." There were superior orders that prohibited visits to prisoners condemned to death, but the officer assumed the responsibility of letting her have a 15-minute stay. Ursula showed him what she had in the bundle: a change of clean clothing, the short boots that her son had worn at his wedding, and the sweet milk candy that she had kept for him since the day she had sensed his return. She found Colonel Aureliano Buendia in the room that was used as a cell, lying on a cot with his arms spread out because his armpits were paved with sores. They had allowed him to shave. The thick moustache with twisted ends accentuated the sharp angles of his cheekbones. He looked paler to Ursula than when he had left, a little taller, and more solitary than ever. He knew all about the details of the house: Pietro Crespi's suicide, Arcadio's arbitrary acts and execution, the dauntlessness of José Arcadio Buendia underneath the chestnut tree. He knew that Amaranta had consecrated her virginal widowhood to the rearing of Aureliano José, and that the latter was beginning to show signs of quite good judgment, and that he had learned to read and write at the same time as he had learned to speak. From the moment in which she entered the room, Ursula felt inhibited by the maturity of her son, by his aura of command, by the glow of authority that radiated from his skin. She was surprised that he was so well informed. "You knew all along that I was a wizard," he joked. And he added in a serious tone, "This morning, when they brought me in, I had the impression that I had already been through all that before." In fact, while the crowd was roaring alongside him, he had been concentrating his thoughts, startled at how the town had aged. The leaves of the almond trees were broken. The houses painted blue, then painted red, had ended up with an indefinable coloration. "What did you expect?" Ursula sighed. "Time passes." That's how it goes," Aureliano admitted. "But not so much." In that way, the long-awaited visit, for which both had prepared questions and had even anticipated answers, was once more the usual everyday conversation. When the guard announced the end of the visit, Aureliano took out a roll of sweaty papers from under the cot. They were his poetry, the poems inspired by Remedios, which he had taken with him when he left, and those he had written later on during chance pauses in the war. "Promise me that no one will read them," he said. "Light the oven with them this very night." Ursula promised, and stood up to kiss him goodbye. "I brought you a revolver," she murmured. Colonel Aureliano Buendia saw that the sentry could not see. "It won't do me any good," he said in a low voice. "But give it to me in case they search you on the way out." Ursula took the revolver out of her bodice and put it under the mattress of the cot. "And don't say goodbye," he concluded with emphatic calmness. "Don't beg or bow down to anyone. Pretend that they shot me a long time ago." Ursula bit her lip so as not to cry. "Put some hot stones on those sores," she said. She turned halfway around and left the room. Colonel Aureliano Buendia remained standing, thoughtful, until the door closed. Then he lay down again with his arms open. Since the beginning of adolescence, when he had begun to be aware of his premonitions, he thought that death would be announced with a definite, unequivocal, irrevocable signal. But there were only a few hours left before he would die, and the signal had not come. On a certain occasion, a very beautiful woman had come into his camp in Chukarinka and asked the sentries permission to see him. They let her through because they were aware of the fanaticism of some mothers who sent their daughters to the bedrooms of the most famous warriors, according to what they said, to improve the breed. That night, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was finishing the poem about the man who is lost in the rain when the girl came into his room. He turned his back to her to put the sheet of paper into the locked drawer where he kept his poetry. And then he sensed it. He grasped the pistol in the drawer without turning his head. "Please don't shoot," he said. When he turned around holding his pistol, the girl had lowered hers and did not know what to do. In that way he had avoided 4 out of 11 traps. On the other hand, someone who was never caught entered the revolutionary headquarters one night in Manaure and stabbed to death his close friend, Colonel Magnifico Bisbal, to whom he had given his cot so that he could sweat out a fever. A few yards away, sleeping in a hammock in the same room, he was not aware of anything. His efforts to systemize his premonitions were useless. They would come suddenly in a wave of supernatural lucidity, like an absolute and momentous conviction, but they could not be grasped. On occasion they were so natural that he identified them as premonitions only after they had been fulfilled. Frequently they were nothing but ordinary bits of superstition. But when they condemned him to death and asked him to state his last wish, he did not have the least difficulty in identifying the premonition that inspired his answer. "I ask that the sentence be carried out in Macondo," he said. The president of the court-martial was annoyed. "Don't be clever, Buendia," he told him. "That's just a trick to gain more time." "If you don't fulfill it, that will be your worry," the colonel said. "But that's my last wish." Since then, the premonitions had abandoned him. The day when Ursula visited him in jail, after a great deal of thinking, he came to the conclusion that perhaps death would not be announced that time, because it did not depend on chance, but on the will of his executioners. He spent the night awake, tormented by the pain of his sores. A little before dawn he heard steps in the hallway. "They're coming," he said to himself, and for no reason he thought of José Arcadio Buendia, who at that moment was thinking about him under the dreary dawn of the chestnut tree. He did not feel fear or nostalgia, but an intestinal rage at the idea that this artificial death would not let him see the end of so many things that he had left unfinished. The door opened, and a sentry came in with a mug of coffee. On the following day at the same hour he would still be doing what he was then, raging with the pain in his armpits, and the same thing happened. On Thursday he shared the sweet milk candy with the guards and put on his clean clothes, which were tight for him, and the patent leather boots. By Friday they had still not shot him. Actually, they did not dare carry out the sentence. The rebelliousness of the town made the military men think that the execution of Colonel Aureliano Buendia might have serious political consequences, not only in Macondo, but throughout the area of the swamp. So they consulted the authorities in the capital of the province. On Saturday night, while they were waiting for an answer, Captain Roque Carnicero went with some other officers to Caterino's place. Only one woman, practically threatened, dared take him to her room. "They don't want to go to bed with a man they know is going to die," she confessed to him. "No one knows how it will come, but everybody is going around saying that the officer who shoots Colonel Aureliano Buendia and all the soldiers in the squad, one by one, will be murdered with no escape sooner or later, even if they hide at the ends of the earth." Captain Roque Carnicero mentioned it to the other officers, and they told their superiors. On Sunday, although no one had revealed it openly, although no action on the part of the military had disturbed the tense calm of those days, the whole town knew that the officers were ready to use any manner of pretexts to avoid responsibility for the execution. The official order arrived in the Monday mail. The execution was to be carried out within 24 hours. That night, the officers put 7 slips of paper into a cap, and Captain Roque Carnicero's unpeaceful fate was foreseen by his name on the prize slip. "Bad luck doesn't have any chinks in it," he said with deep bitterness. "I was born a son of a bitch, and I'm going to die a son of a bitch." At 5 in the morning, he chose the squad by lot, formed it in the courtyard, and woke up the condemned man with a premonitory phrase. "Let's go, Buendia," he told him. "Our time has come." "So that's what it was," the colonel replied. "I was dreaming that my sores had burst." Rebecca Buendia got up at 3 in the morning when she learned that Aureliano would be shot. She stayed in the bedroom in the dark, watching the cemetery wall through the half-opened window, as the bed on which she sat shook with José Arcadio's snoring. She had waited all week with the same hidden persistence with which during different times she had waited for Pietro Crespi's letters. "They won't shoot him here," José Arcadio told her. "They'll shoot him at midnight in the barracks so that no one will know who made up the squad, and they'll bury him right there." Rebecca kept on waiting. "They're stupid enough to shoot him here," she said. She was so certain that she had foreseen the way she would open the door to wave goodbye. "They won't bring him through the streets," José Arcadio insisted, "with 6 scared soldiers and knowing that the people are ready for anything." Indifferent to her husband's logic, Rebecca stayed by the window. "You'll see that they're just stupid enough," she said. On Tuesday, at 5 in the morning, José Arcadio had drunk his coffee and let the dogs out when Rebecca closed the window and held on to the head of the bed so as not to fall down. They're bringing him," she sighed. "He's so handsome." José Arcadio looked out the window and saw him, tremulous in the light of dawn. He already had his back to the wall, and his hands were on his hips, because the burning knots in his armpits would not let him lower them. "A person fucks himself up so much," Colonel Aureliano Buendia said. "Fucks himself up so much just so that 6 weak fairies can kill him, and he can't do anything about it." He repeated it with so much rage that it almost seemed to be fervour, and Captain Roque Carnicero was touched, because he thought he was praying. When the squad took aim, the rage had materialized into a vicious and bitter substance that put his tongue to sleep and made him close his eyes. Then the aluminium glow of dawn disappeared, and he saw himself again in short pants, wearing a tie around his neck, and he saw his father leading him into the tent on a splendid afternoon, and he saw the ice. When he heard the shout, He thought that it was the final command to the squad. He opened his eyes with a shudder of curiosity, expecting to meet the incandescent trajectory of the bullets. But he only saw Captain Roque Carnicero with his arms in the air, and José Arcadio crossing the street with his fearsome shotgun ready to go off. "Don't shoot," the captain said to José Arcadio. "You were sent by divine providence." Another war began right there. Captain Roque Carnicero and his 6 men left with Colonel Aureliano Buendia to free the revolutionary general Victorio Medina, who had been condemned to death in Rio Hacha. They thought they could save time by crossing the mountains along the trail that José Arcadio Buendia had followed to found Macondo. But before a week was out, they were convinced that it was an impossible undertaking. So they had to follow the dangerous route over the outcroppings, with no other munitions but what the firing squad had. They would camp near the towns, and one of them, with a small gold fish in his hand, would go in disguise in broad daylight to contact the dormant liberals, who would go out hunting on the following morning and never return. When they saw Rio Hacha from a ridge in the mountains, General Victorio Medina had been shot. Colonel Aureliano Buendia's men proclaimed him chief of the revolutionary forces of the Caribbean coast with the rank of general. He assumed the position but refused the promotion and took the stand that he would never accept it as long as the conservative regime was in power. At the end of 3 months, they had succeeded in arming more than 1,000 men, but they were wiped out. The survivors reached the eastern frontier. The next thing that was heard of them was that they had landed on Cabo de la Vela, coming from the smaller islands of the Antilles, and a message from the government was sent all over by telegraph and included in jubilant proclamations throughout the country, announcing the death of Colonel Aureliano Buendia. But 2 days later, a multiple telegram which almost overtook the previous one announced another uprising on the southern plains. That was how the legend of the ubiquitous Colonel Aureliano Buendia began. Simultaneous and contradictory information declared him victorious in Villanueva, defeated in Guacamayal, devoured by Motilon Indians, dead in a village in the swamp, and up in arms again in Urumita. The liberal leaders, who at that moment were negotiating for participation in the Congress, branded him an adventurer who did not represent the party. The national government placed him in the category of a bandit and put a price of 5,000 pesos on his head. After 16 defeats, Colonel Aureliano Buendia left Guajira with 2,000 well-armed Indians, and the garrison, which was taken by surprise as it slept, abandoned Rio Hacha. He established his headquarters there and proclaimed total war against the regime. The first message he received from the government was a threat to shoot Colonel Gerineldo Marquez within 48 hours if he did not withdraw with his forces to the eastern frontier. Colonel Roque Carnicero, who was his chief of staff then, gave him the telegram with a look of consternation, but he read it with unforeseen joy. "How wonderful!" he exclaimed. "We have a telegraph office in Macondo now." His reply was definitive. In 3 months he expected to establish his headquarters in Macondo. If he did not find Colonel Gerineldo Marquez alive at that time, he would shoot out of hand all of the officers he held prisoner at that moment, starting with the generals, and he would give orders to his subordinates to do the same for the rest of the war. 3 months later, when he entered Macondo in triumph, the first embrace he received on the swamp road was that of Colonel Gerineldo Marquez. The house was full of children. Ursula had taken in Santa Sofia de la Piedad with her older daughter and a pair of twins, who had been born 5 months after Arcadio had been shot. Contrary to the victim's last wishes, she baptized the girl with the name Remedios. I'm sure that was what Arcadio meant, she alleged. We won't call her Ursula because a person suffers too much with the name. The twins were named José Arcadio Segundo and Aureliano Segundo. Amaranta took care of them all. She put small wooden chairs in the living room and established a nursery with other children from neighbouring families. When Colonel Aureliano Buendia returned in the midst of exploding rockets and ringing bells, a children's chorus welcomed him to the house. Aureliano José, tall like his grandfather, dressed as a revolutionary officer, gave him military honours. Not all the news was good. A year after the flight of Colonel Aureliano Buendia, José Arcadio and Rebecca went to live in the house Arcadio had built. No one knew about his intervention to halt the execution. In the new house, located on the best corner of the square, in the shade of an almond tree that was honoured by 3 nests of redbreasts, with a large door for visitors and 4 windows for light, they set up a hospitable home. Rebecca's old friends, among them 4 of the Moscote sisters, who were still single, once more took up the sessions of embroidery that had been interrupted years before on the porch with the begonias. José Arcadio continued to profit from the usurped lands, the title to which was recognized by the conservative government. Every afternoon he could be seen returning on horseback with his hunting dogs and his double-barreled shotgun and a string of rabbits hanging from his saddle. One September afternoon, with the threat of a storm, he returned home earlier than usual. He greeted Rebecca in the dining room, tied the dogs up in the courtyard, hung the rabbits up in the kitchen to be salted later, and went to the bedroom to change his clothes. Rebecca later declared that when her husband went into the bedroom, she was locked in the bathroom and did not hear anything. It was a difficult version to believe, but there was no other more plausible, and no one could think of any motive for Rebecca to murder the man who had made her happy. That was perhaps the only mystery that was never cleared up in the condo. As soon as José Arcadio closed the bedroom door, the sound of a pistol shot echoed through the house. A trickle of blood came out under the door, crossed the living room, went out into the street, continued on in a straight line across the uneven terraces, went down steps and climbed over curbs, passed along the street of the Turks, turned a corner to the right and another to the left, made a right angle at the Buendia's house, went in under the closed door, crossed through the parlour, hugging the wall so as not to stain the rugs, went on to the other living room, made a wide curve to avoid the dining room table, went along the porch with the begonias, and passed without being seen under Amaranta's chair as she gave an arithmetic lesson to Aureliano José, and went through the pantry and came out in the kitchen where Ursula was getting ready to crack 36 eggs to make bread. "Holy Mother of God!" Ursula shouted. She followed the thread of blood back along its course, and in search of its origin she went through the pantry, along the begonia porch, where Aureliano José was chanting that 3 + 3 is 6, and 6 + 3 is 9, and she crossed the dining room and the living rooms and followed straight down the street, and she turned first to the right and then to the left to the Street of the Turks, forgetting that she was still wearing her baking apron and her house slippers, and she came out onto the square and went into the door of a house where she had never been, and she pushed open the bedroom door and was almost suffocated by the smell of burned gunpowder. And she found José Arcadio lying face down on the ground on top of the leggings she had just taken off. And she saw the starting point of the thread of blood that had already stopped flowing out of his right ear. They found no wound on his body, nor could they locate the weapon. Nor was it possible to remove the smell of powder from the corpse. First they washed him 3 times with soap and a scrubbing brush. Then they rubbed him with salt and vinegar, then with ashes and lemon, and finally they put him in a barrel of lye and let him stay for 6 hours. They scrubbed him so much that arabesques of his tattooing began to fade. When they thought of the desperate measure of seasoning him with pepper, cumin seeds, and laurel leaves, and boiling him for a whole day over a slow fire, he had already begun to decompose, and they had to bury him hastily. They sealed him hermetically in a special coffin 7.5 feet long and 4 feet wide, reinforced inside with iron plates and fastened together with steel bolts. And even then the smell could be perceived on the streets through which the funeral procession passed. Father Nicanor, with his liver enlarged and tight as a drum, gave him his blessing from bed. Although in the months that followed they reinforced the grave with walls about it, between which they threw compressed ash, sawdust, and quicklime, the cemetery still smelled of powder for many years after, until the engineers from the Banana Company covered the grave over with a shell of concrete. As soon as they took the body out, Rebecca closed the doors of her house and buried herself alive, covered with a thick crust of disdain that no earthly temptation was ever able to break. She went out into the street on one occasion, when she was very old, with shoes the colour of old silver and a hat made of tiny flowers, during the time that the wandering Jew passed through town and brought on a heat wave that was so intense that birds broke through window screens to come to die in the bedrooms. The last time anyone saw her alive was when with one shot she killed a thief who was trying to force the door of her house. Except for Argenida, her servant and confidant, no one ever had any more contact with her after that. At one time it was discovered that she was writing letters to the bishop, whom she claimed as a first cousin, but it was never said whether she received any reply. The town forgot about her. In spite of his triumphal return, Colonel Aureliano Buendia was not enthusiastic over the looks of things. The government troops abandoned their positions without resistance, and that aroused an illusion of victory among the liberal population that it was not right to destroy. But the revolutionaries knew the truth. Colonel Aureliano Buendia better than any of them. Although at that moment he had more than 5,000 men under his command and held 2 coastal states, he had the feeling of being hemmed in against the sea and caught in a situation that was so confused that when he ordered the restoration of the church steeple, which had been knocked down by army cannon fire, Father Nicanor commented from his sickbed, "This is silly. The defenders of the faith of Christ destroy the church, and the masons order it rebuilt." Looking for a loophole through which he could escape, he spent hours on end in the telegraph office, conferring with the commanders of other towns, and every time he would emerge with the firmest impression that the war was at a stalemate. When news of fresh liberal victories was received, it was celebrated with jubilant proclamations, but he would measure the real extent of them on the map, and could see that his forces were penetrating into the jungle, defending themselves against malaria and mosquitoes, advancing in the opposite direction from reality. "We're wasting time," he would complain to his officers. "We're wasting time while the bastards in the party are begging for seats in Congress." Lying awake at night, stretched out on his back in a hammock in the same room where he had awaited death, he would evoke the image of lawyers dressed in black, leaving the presidential palace in the icy cold of early morning, with their coat collars turned up about their ears, rubbing their hands, whispering, taking refuge in dreary early-morning cafes to speculate over what the president had meant when he said yes, or what he had meant when he said no, and even to imagine what the president was thinking when he said something quite different, as he chased away mosquitoes at a temperature of 95 degrees, feeling the approach of the fearsome dawn when he would have to give his men the command to jump into the sea.